All right, we're recording. This is the Gateway API meeting for April 14. We've got lots to get through, so that's exciting. Danian, I think you're first up. Appreciate the idea here of trying to get some more clarity around v0.3.0.
Yeah, I know we went through this process with previous releases, especially trying to get v1 alpha 1 out the door of just saying, all right, let's set a specific time and then start going through the milestone issues and tagging, kind of prioritizing. And the reason for that is we in the Contour community, as you know, been on the implementation journey, and we've been using 0.2.0 and kind of at the point where it's like, okay, do we start following a specific SHA, or do we wait for 0.3.0? And a lot of that's going to depend on what date target for 0.3.0, and I prefer to go to 0.3.0, but again, depending on the target date.
My goal, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. My goal had been to get a v0.3.0 out end of April. So that really leaves us 2 weeks, which is not a lot of time, but there's also not a lot that we need to get into v0.3.0, in my opinion. There's a lot of nice to haves, but not much. And we can go through this to make sure, but I don't think we have much that absolutely needs to fit in here. But that's my idea. Does that timeline make sense to you?
Yeah, no, that'd be great, not only for Contour, but I think it also would be nice to release shortly before KubeCon.
Yeah, that's a great goal as well. And I should say, like, my idea with this release is really to try one, to clean up a few more things, whatever's possible to clean up before we start working towards v1 alpha 2, but also to potentially add a few more features while we can still experiment in v1 alpha 1, because we can still add things here and potentially change them in v1 alpha 2, but this gives us a little bit of a window to experiment with, say, something like timeouts. Maybe we don't get it completely right the first time. We could tweak that in v1 alpha 2, but I really see this as the final release before v1 alpha 2. And if we're okay with that, then yeah.
That sounds okay, good to me. And so, yeah, if we could maybe go through and say, okay, like what we did before, prioritize, like this is a must have, this is a nice to have, and then look at what that list is, and let's just pick a date that we can set on a milestone and lock it in.
Sounds good to me too.
Great. All right, so this one, let's start at the top. This is I have a follow-up for this later on, but maybe I'll just skip ahead to it. This is a nice to have in my mind. This is a way to dramatically improve UX by providing some kind of insight or visibility here. This overlaps a lot with the concept of either fixing this upstream or adding some kind of kubectl plugin, either of which are valid. And I'll just briefly skip ahead here. I did reach out to API Machinery and talk with them about, is this a fix that we actually want to have an upstream, and they're open to it. So I have a branch that I'm working on actually fixing this upstream. The really annoying problem with this is that this is implemented by API server, not at kubectl. So it's not like you can tell your users, well, I'll just use, the latest kubectl, because that's not going to solve it. You really need the latest version of Kubernetes, which is going to be a hard sell. So I do want to make this fix. It's going to make life easier for CRDs for years to come, but unfortunately it doesn't solve our short-term issue here. So these are related, but this is not a complete solution for this. Yeah. So I think this is still a nice to have, but I'm interested in others' feedback here.
Yeah, I think the I mean, yeah, this is one of the things that came up when I was going through the status user journeys thing that I had up next. That yeah, having something like this would be good. I think in the absence of, yeah, we could possibly look at doing a plugin as well. Maybe that would be a good way to give something to people easier. That I agree that we should try and push this upstream, but maybe a plugin might be quicker in the short term.
Yeah, plugins are like relatively straightforward to build. The maintenance burden is what I'm more concerned about here.
Yeah. Yeah,
but yeah,
I was just gonna say it does seem to me that it might make sense to have something that makes it easier to pull the status of the whole system. So something that eventually could also do like the lookup for you. So it's instead of having to do kubectl get gateway, kubectl get HTTP route or whatever. You could just be like kubectl gateway status, and then the gateway name, and then it looks up the gateway, and then all of the any associated routes in one go. That seems like it would be pretty useful, as especially to start with, where some of those rules might be a bit tricky for people to pass with their head.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think we could build some really cool stuff around this. I mean, my head kept on going a bit past them, thinking, well, if I really want this, I want some kind of like graph, some kind of tree diagram to show the relationships here. But you can only go so far. But I agree, there's a lot of room for some powerful visualizations, I guess. Or just even a simple show the connections between gateway and routes could help a lot. Yeah, and maybe that is what we need, as opposed to these, providing a better kubectl experience is, I think, a good start, because as much as we can provide additional functionality on the side, 100% of our users are going to be using kubectl, or 99.9, right? And then on top of that, we can provide better experiences through plugins or whatever else that really bridge the rest of the gap.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that I feel like is an advantage of doing some sort of plugin thing relatively early is that you can iterate really fast on it and change things very quickly. Much more quickly than if we needed to push changes upstream.
So just to maybe ask some of the others here, how do we feel about bringing a plugin into a kubectl plugin into the scope of this project? Like, obviously, any one of us could build our own unofficial kubectl plugin and just say, hey, this is the thing you can use. And there's not really any kind of long-term support guarantees with that. Or we could try and bring this in scope for this project and make it kind of a core idea of how you interact with these APIs.
I worry about the user penetration of something like that. Like I use 1 or 2 kubectl plugins. I should use more, but I'm just too lazy to go look them up or install them, or my security systems on my machine make it hard to download new plugins. Like, I think that you just get not that high of a penetration amongst users. Like, maybe, like, how many do you think we'll hit of the average gateway user? Like 10%, 5, 25. Like, at that point, I don't know if it starts to become worth it. I think if we see a bunch more of these workflows where it's like we want to display some status that's very important that we cannot do otherwise, then I think it becomes more relevant. But I'm not sure if we have enough of these yet to really warrant trying to support. But that's my opinion. Happy to see if anyone else feels differently.
I agree with you, Mark. And I'd also say, like, I know because I'm so heads down in the implementation side of things, I just don't have the same bandwidth that that I did before the implementation. So, you know, and then near term, it's tough because a lot of the folks on the call are handling the implementation side. You know, add even more to the scope of what the project consists of.
Yeah, even as someone who supports yeah, the idea of just having a plugin, it feels like one of us just, you know, making something quickly now would be a better sort of proof of concept, and then we decide later on how useful it is and whether it's worth bringing it in.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think this is a great starting point where anyone who feels like building a plugin for this can, and I think that could improve experience a lot. And if it does, we can talk about pulling it into the scope of this. But yeah, like people are saying, you know, we've got a lot going on. But I think this is going to come back up pretty quickly with what you mentioned, Nick, your doc that we'll get it to. I think the next item shows a lot of the limitations right now of the UX of using Gateway. So this will return. But to make sure we don't spend all our time on this one, let me how do we want to prioritize these? Last time we used the priority labels, and I think this is going to be an important long-term. I think that's what we'll call a nice to have. Does that seem fair?
Yeah, I think nice to have is important long-term.
Okay.
A must-have is a critical urgent.
Yeah, that works. All right, this is the same thing. So one is a PR, one is the issue. So let me add the same one to this. All right, custom and implementation specific support levels. I think Bowie had volunteered on this one. We have some just confusion around these. I don't know. I mean, this would be good to clean up, but it doesn't feel like anything that needs to be cleaned up as part of a release. This is more of a documentation thing to me.
Yeah, I would say again, long term.
Yeah, okay.
What was the other? Urgent, long term, and then there was one other one too.
Backlog.
There's a backlog. Oh, wrong area. I'm also fine to pull this out of the milestone entirely, because it's not really tied to since it's documentation. I don't think it's tied to. Well, no, this changes comments for API types. So yeah, we have some inconsistency there. See if I can actually type and actually get the right thing. All right, long term. And load balancer source ranges. I think this is feeling like another long term at best. Any disagreement on that one?
Yeah, I can't speak to this. I'm not familiar with that particular issue.
Yeah, this is basically pulling up the concept. You know, there's a field on service, load balancer source ranges, allows you to set a range of IPs that can access the load balancer.
Yeah, that's an annotation on a service, right?
I thought it's a field. I can't remember.
It's both.
Okay. So this is related to a topic that I have later on, timeouts for connection details. To me, this feels a little bit more important than the rest, but not required. to me, I would call this a soon instead of a long-term, but I am open to long-term as well.
Is this associated to the issue in the PR that I opened up ages ago, where we keep kind of going back and forth on where do these settings exist, right? I mean, first it was alongside the forward to, and we talked about using the backend policy.
Yes.
I just wanted to just make sure that we have linkages between this and the
it
issue
is.
PR. Okay.
It is. Yeah. And my idea now is to maybe we can try and fill out backend policy a little bit, even with the idea that it could shift to service policy or something that can be tied to different levels of the stack. But if we have the idea of a resource that can be attached to route or backend, as an example, then that feels like an appropriate place for that. And so, and I don't want to go too off track here, but that's kind of my vision for this. And if that's possible, then I feel like that policy resource is a decent fit. But open to ideas.
You're talking about that, is it service policy that Mark highlighted last week? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. We're talking about a bunch of things that are like just a few items down on the agenda. So, but yeah, I think I'm fine with long-term as well. This is definitely not critical urgent. But I would like to get this in soon-ish.
Yeah, I think it's better to keep it soon and try to experiment in this area of the API, because this area of the API we don't have enough experimentation going on to get some feedback.
Yeah, that's
yes. Yeah. So I don't see this as required for 030, but maybe, you know, because it's a soon, like after 030, right? We keep kind of dancing around this and discussing it, and maybe we need to just, you know, at some point after 030 say, okay, let's really kind of focus in on this particular area of the API and figure out where we move forward. I don't know.
Yeah, my take on this is long-term means it's nice to have an 030, but does not matter at all if it gets in. Soon is something like we should prioritize and try to get in for 030, but if it doesn't work, okay. And critical urgent is something like we should block 030 on if we don't get it in.
Yep,
okay.
Perfect. Yeah.
Agreed.
Cool. Health check per service. I also have a follow-up coming for this. It looks like this feels like a relatively portable feature, and we'll get into that later, but this feels very similar in concept to timeout. So nice to have. I guess timeout is potentially more portable than this, but we'll get there later. But to me, this is somewhere between soon and long-term. Anyone feel like being a tiebreaker, pushing it one direction or the other?
I lean towards soon. Just it seems like, again, there's relevancy here with that service policy, right? I mean, Mark, jump in here if I'm off base, but right, could I potentially create a service policy that defines health checking and timeouts and all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree. I think health checks is, like, at least from what we see, is one of the very first things that customers are looking at to customize. That might be, you know, for use cases where they should be different than the pod health check. So I do think this is important and soon. And the service policy, like, it's such a big topic and it can go so many ways. And Nick, I really appreciate your feedback so far on it. I don't know how long that'll take to close, to be honest. So I'm just worried about blocking on service policy for too long while we try to figure that out, and then blocking features that I think are probably important in the short term.
It feels to me like, as Rob said earlier, before we go to V1 Alpha 2 is a good time to just try something out here, because we can be like, oh, that didn't work as well as we thought, or something like that. Once we go to V1 Alpha 2, we're better off just cutting, even if it's not a full CID, but just like some extra structs or something like that, to be like, we have a struct that you reuse at different places. That's better than jumping through the, you know, let's make a whole extra CRD thing. If you just have the same struct, then it's pretty easy to change that into a CRD later.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to Mark's point, I do agree that service policy is going to take some time to move forward on. We intend on doing that, and so yeah, it would be nice to have these features. The last one, the connection timeouts and the health checking in. And when we've discussed service policy, it almost seems like it could be an iteration of the backend policy. So maybe moving forward with the timeouts and the health checking, it would make sense to move forward with adding this functionality to the backend policy.
Yeah.
So it's kind of what I'm envisioning.
That's exactly what I've been thinking. If we can try to add some content to backend policy and experiment with that a little bit, it will help give us some basic understanding of how these kind of policy resources work at one level, and help us as we talk about service policy, because we have some concrete config in backend policy. And I think service policy is just kind of the natural evolution of that. So yeah, trying to get this into 0.3.0 I think would be great.
Yep. We have a little bit of prior art in Contour as well, because in HTTP proxy we have a set of different policy objects that have that control settings like this. So we actually have a timeout policy, a load balancer policy. These are all structs, not full objects. And there's a few cases in which we use those structs at different points in the CRD hierarchy.
Yeah, Nick, so to your point, a backend policy for now could have, a struct for timeout policies, another struct for health check policies. And then as we figure out service policy, again, we could potentially just take everything from backend policy, move it over to service policy, and then get rid of backend policy. That's the direction we end up going in.
Yeah, agreed. Cool. Okay. I'll keep on moving then. Or unless there was anything else to say here. We'll be coming right back to this later on.
Yeah, I guess the only point is do the specified health check. So the 97 there. Oh, there it is.
Yep.
Oh, never mind.
Yeah.
I didn't see. Yeah. Okay, we're good.
Yeah, the back did not load it properly. All right. Support for external traffic policy. This feels to me like a long-term concept. Does not feel critical. Anyone disagree?
+1 for me.
Yeah, I agree.
Cool. And next, request retry attributes for HTTP route API. Danian, you have the most context on this one. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, I can go and update that PR. As you can see, it's only a few days old.
Right.
Right. This kind of goes back to the backend policy. What I could potentially do here, or Harry, if you want to jump in, and to Nick's point is, do we have a retry policy struct within the backend policy where we can go ahead and expose different retry attributes?
Yeah, I think this actually fits in nicely with health checks and timeouts, but we will have to prioritize, like, out of these three things, maybe we prioritize 2 things, or maybe we can ship all those 3 things. So we'll need to have a little more fine-grained priority there. But I think it goes well into backend policy conversation we just were having 2 minutes ago.
I agree with all that. And I spent some time looking at the portability of these different features, like what implementations actually support these concepts. And of what I found, health checks and timeouts seem to, at least a generic request timeout, seem to be the most broadly supported. And the request retry seem to be slightly less supported across implementations. So that would lead me to prioritize this a little bit below the other 2. But I agree that it fits in and is related very closely to the other ones.
Yeah, I think I agree with that analysis of portability. Right? So I think health checks, timeouts also have some weird edge cases, but health checks are usually, they are high level enough in terms of like which layer of the stack they target and how users expect them to work. Like that's pretty portable.
Yeah.
So let's maybe just tag. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I 100% agree about with your statement now, Harry, about timeouts having edge cases. I know that when I first started trying to understand the Envoy timeouts, it did not work how I expect. So I think when we do the timeouts, you need to be really careful about defining what each timeout is. Sorry, that's a bit of a tangent.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but I found approximately one timeout that could potentially be portable. But there, every implementation supports a long list of timeouts. But yeah, we'll get there.
So maybe 184, we just tag it as long-term, and then I'll jump in and kind of associate 184 with some of these other issues related to kind of timeouts and health checking and stuff like that.
Sounds good. Let's see. All right, that worked. Forwarding shortcut to gateway listener. There's already a PR for this, Steve. Thank you. I think this PR is later on triage. I know this got bogged down a little bit with some feedback. How do we feel about this? Is it soon or long term?
I think we should get this in anyhow. Like it's far enough in the triads that it's a matter of just having some discussion and just getting this feature in.
Yeah, and I think what we've said earlier, it lines up well here. This is the time to try and get features in while we can experiment and test them out. So yeah, it's this close. We might as well get it in. Is soon sufficient, or do we want to bump this up to critical?
I would vote for critical.
Okay.
I mean, not too strongly. I don't feel very strongly about it. So.
Anyone disagree? We'll go with it. It would be a real shame to have a PR sitting and not be able to get it in another 2 weeks. This is something we've wanted for a while. So yeah. All right, the next one, query param matching. This came in as a request a while ago. This feels to me like enough of an edge case that we can call it long-term.
That's a +1 for me.
Okay. And John, are you on this call? Do you have, I can't remember the context of this issue when multiple controllers are involved. Okay, yes. This could be good to get in. So the idea that it can be hard to clean up after yourself if you don't have some additional information about what controller put a gateway in status to begin with. And so adding controller name to that reference, this feels really small in scope and could potentially help implementations play nicely together. Any preference on prioritization? I think this is either soon or maybe long-term, but it seems simple enough that I'd lean towards soon.
Agreed from me with soon.
Great. All right. That's that. While we're at this milestone, I think your key goal was to actually set a date on this. I said end of month. End of month is a Friday. Never release things on Friday. So I'd lean towards 29th. Is that acceptable, or do we want to push back to 28th?
29th seems fine to me. Daniel?
No, that sounds good. I guess the only thing that crossed my mind is on the 28th, maybe actually using the community meeting to cut the release. But maybe that'll take longer than the time we have in the community meeting.
Yeah, I figured I don't want to be too optimistic. I thought about that as well. And if we get to that point, that's great. But I like the idea of having one last community meeting where we can just pick through the last little bits of issues for the release and then have a day to, get those in. It gives us just that last little bit of wiggle room.
Yeah, that's a good call. Let's do that. So 29th, and then do we have anyone identified to kind of handle the mechanics of the cutting the release? Anyone available to do that?
I'm open to volunteers. I think I handled the first release. Harry handled the second. If anyone wants to volunteer for this one, by all means. If not, I'm happy to take it again.
Same here.
All right. Well, we can come back to that. But yeah, leave it open. I think anyone who's listed in the owner's file is welcome to take this release on. But I think you do need to have that level of access to release. Cool. All right, Nick, take it away. This was a great doc. I read through all of it and had more thoughts I didn't get turned into comments yet, but maybe if you want to run through some of the highlights here.
Yeah, so the reason I wrote this was that I was starting to do some stuff with figuring out how what status updates Contour would be doing on routes, and I sort of like, oh, there's only the admitted condition right now. There's a lot of information on listener. I was like, well, how would actually that would even work if you're the different personas? Like, what does it look like to actually consume the status of this? And then I realized that no one had done that. So I thought, well, I'll sit down and write and ask some questions and then figure out how we currently answer them. So yeah, I split this up by the 3 personas. So, and sort of wanted to ask, like, for each persona, how do I look up the information that's supposed to be relevant to me? I think in the current APAC and roles design, it's made pretty clear that that anybody who uses this API should have read access to everything, to all the different types of object. And so that's kind of, it's not that you can't look at the objects, it's that, like, what do you want to look at is what I was sort of thinking. And I sort of try to keep a couple of things in mind when thinking about the status for these for any CID, and that's like, you want to keep it so that there's a minimal number of kubectl commands to understand what the system is doing, a minimal number of lookups, and that especially that you shouldn't need to go look up an object, then that tells you to go and look up another object that tells you to go and look up another object. You should be able to start from the relevant object. So with the infrastructure admin, there was a few things that came up. I think the first one that you commented on, Rob, was important, but I think we have an answer there now. That I think you and I agreed, at least, that we should recommend that when you are installing a controller, it should come with YAMLs or install a gateway class for you that describes gateways that it will set up for you. There should be something that indicates it should be included or at least have directions. And so so I'm not sure how deep you want me to go. I don't want to go through every question. I'd encourage everyone to have a read of this. But like, one of the a couple of really big things that I thought is really important is that there should be, I think the thing that's really important is that we address some way for the controller that is implementing a gateway class should have a way to say, here's the things I support. I think it should probably be on the gateway class. I think, Mark, you opened an issue about this. I think that there's another comment about that on there. There should be there was a couple of other sort of extra bits of info that came up. And then the second one that's further down is that, I think we need a little bit more info on routes, like in the status on routes. But Mark, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, there's so many, so I'm going through right now in terms of like our cloud load balancers and what they support in the gateway classes. And so we end up having basically like a spreadsheet that is the gateway API spec. Within every cell is kind of like, do we support it? If we do support it, what do we support? Like, for instance, like what ports we support. We only support 3 ports on our external load balancer. And so in the ports field of that sheet, it's kind of like that. And so this is kind of becoming our way of expressing through the gateway class. I don't know, maybe that's a separate tool that does that, because it's you basically have to print out the entire surface area of the API to show every field that might be supported, which I think would be complex to support on the gateway class resource itself. Maybe not. Maybe there should be a separate tool to basically like look at a gateway class and then spit out kind of all the fields that are supported or not. I don't know, but yeah, I agree it's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I was thinking was that, is that it feels like it would be useful to me at the very least to have something that can indicate to you what sort of controller it is. Does it run like an ingress controller where it runs in cluster, and to an extent it's up there's something else that figures out how to get the traffic to the cluster. That's for Contour, that's what we do right now. I think a lot of the other ingress controllers, like in the past, we've leaned on service to type load balancer or stuff like that. So the ingress controller is about taking one Kubernetes service and making it able to route traffic to a bunch of other ones, as opposed to something like a cloud load balancer that's creating an infrastructure like upstream for you that will handle you're actually getting the traffic into the cluster. So that feels like a really key distinction in what a gateway controller could do. And the other thing that feels like a really important bit of information is what types of routes do you support? I know that further down, Rob raised a good point that for a gateway, it's pretty easy to check what types of gateways you can bind, what types of routes you can bind to a particular gateway, because the kind field there's a thing further down, if you scroll down, Rob, under cluster operator, what functionality does each gateway class support, I think. And then there's another one. It's actually under application developer. How do I know what kind of routes can I use with a particular gateway? That one, there's a kind field in the route binding selector, so that's the way that you can tell. But if you're creating a gateway, if you're a cluster operator who's creating a gateway, how do you know what kinds you can put in that thing without? I mean, right now you got to go and look up the implementation documentation for the controller that you're using. Feels like that would be a nice, reasonably easy thing to put into a status of a gateway class that would then mean that this whole thing is discoverable without having to go out to look at external documentation.
Yeah, I agree. I think I agree with what both you and Mark said here. Like we can't include every specific detail of what an implementation may or may not support, but the high level things of what protocols does this, is it L4, L7, are there specific extra ones that the specific implementation supports? Let's say gRPC, maybe not everyone supports that, etc. Yep. And build on that. I think those kind of high level things will get us a long ways. I created an issue that suggested we could have a description, just a string field that describes a gateway or a gateway class specifically, but it may also help to have a few fields like this that describe capabilities, like you're suggesting, like probably the protocols, the port type, the route types, and like you're describing how it's deployed. Like, is this cloud load balancers? Is this in-cluster proxy, something else. Those feel pretty generic and very useful to have.
Yep. And the other thing that I think that really gives us is it gives us a way to sort of define, for lack of a better word, conformance profiles. That's different to the support profiles that we're talking about with core, extended, implementation specific. This is like, because I think in terms of testing to see if a thing fulfills the API contract and in a portable way requires information about how it, what parts of the API contract it fulfills. So, an ingress controller is not going to be able to do layer 4 or something like that, right? Like, there needs to be a way to, if we want to be able to have automated conformance testing, then there needs to be a way for you to know what, in an automated way, in a machine readable way, what the particular controller does. So that way, if we define it there, then that gives us a really easy, clean place to say, the ingress controller conformance profile. Again, I don't know if that's the right words to use, but an ingress controller needs to support at a minimum layer 7 and HTTP and HTTPS or something like that, right? Like, there's some set of features that say this is an in-cluster ingress controller, and that way later on when we are able to define a standard set of tests that you need to meet that thing, then we can start being able to issue like conformance seals that mean that as long as you use the features that are mentioned in the conformance profiles and only the features mentioned in the conformance profiles, then your config should be portable between those things for the larger config, right? Like there might be bits that don't work properly, timeouts or whatever, if they're implementation specific. But if you're using core and maybe extended things, and you're moving between things in the same conformance profile, then it should be portable.
I like those definitions a lot, by the way, because I think that's important, that those are two different things, right? One is your adherence to the spec, and the other one is you maybe completely adhere to the spec, but there are different levels of support within that spec.
Yeah, it feels like they're orthogonal dimensions to an extent.
Yeah.
Does that make sense to everyone else? Or I guess I'm really asking, thanks, Daniel. Sorry, and I'm really asking like Harry and other people who are, doing other implementations, if that's something that makes sense to you. Sorry, Daniel, continue.
Yeah, that was it. I think it does make sense.
Yeah, I think it makes sense quite a bit, and these we internally have had at least a subset of these questions, so it's good that we are having this discussion. But I'll have to get back to you a little later on this.
Yeah, I was thinking that the next steps for me would be to start to make a couple of proposals for some of this stuff. I think the place to start is to just propose something so that we can talk in more concrete terms that as an addition to gateway status. For the later one that I also mentioned about extra information on a route, to propose something there. That one's a bit more in depth, so I don't want to go into too much right now.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And thanks again for writing this. I recommend everyone take some time to read through it, add comments, whatever. I think a number of these items are going to have to turn into follow-up issues or PRs, because these are lots of room for improvement throughout. I think is this is a great way to show what is currently lacking in our UX. And when you get so focused on implementation, it can be easy to miss how painful it is to actually use this APR to fill in the gaps in between. So yeah, appreciate this perspective. And
yep. Yes. Yeah, I think one of the things I wanted to avoid, and like I don't want to throw stones, but I know that the first time that I tried to understand the cert manager's set of CIDs, I found the sort of the cookie following not great. That was a long time ago, so I'm pretty sure they fixed it quite a bit by now. But that was sort of my canonical example of like, if you tried to create a new certificate and it didn't work, you might have to go 4 CRDs deep to understand what had not worked. And there was no way to shortcut that process at all. So yeah, I think that's kind of sucky if that's where you end up at.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we talked about prioritizing adding new features. I think, like health checks, et cetera, timeouts. I think this is another area we should prioritize. As I think Damien mentioned, we're awfully close to KubeCon. There's going to be a lot more discussion and likely usage of Gateway API around that time, whether it's KubeCon talks or articles, blog posts, whatever that are coming out soon. I think there's going to be a lot more attention, and we don't want the first experience with Gateway API to be just one of confusion and frustration, because in that case, we're just, it's going to take years for people to come back and trust it again. So
yeah, so I have some bandwidth to do some work on this now. So yeah, I will be focusing on this for the next while.
Awesome, thanks. Great. Let me keep on running. We've got lots to go through. Actually, next one's yours.
Yeah, so this one, can probably wait. But yeah, there was a really good discussion on Slack after the Effects on Traffic posted their implementation about how different people had different ideas about what the different types of routes were for. So I think that's certainly something, it feels like that's something where we could use some updates to just, I don't think it really matters what we pick, as long as we pick something and write it down and be like, this is what they're for, and this is what they're intended for. Being my understanding was HTTP route is for when you, effectively when you terminate TLS. TLS route is for when you aren't terminating it, but you care about the SNI, and TCP route is when you're just forwarding ports through. Maybe that's TLS, maybe it's not. But I think that needs to be written down.
Yeah, you're right. I think that thread came to a good conclusion, but I don't know that we have a tracking issue for this, but we should, because this feels key. Let me try and add that if I can get my keyboard to work. I can follow up this one. Unless anyone else wants.
Another action item there is we need to have and you can assign that tracking issue to me, is we need to define which protocol and which route type are supported in the core API, right? Like that's like we need to figure out, like, like you can't have a TLS termination and have like you cannot not terminate TLS and still have like TCP routing or something like that. Like, that's a bad example, but something along those lines, we need to figure that out, because that's very important from a conformance standpoint.
Yeah, 100% agree.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool. Okay, I'll create that issue, and thanks for volunteering to follow up, Harry. The next one, I had a doc associated with this too, but I was, related to V1 Alpha 1, V0.3.0. I tried and probably failed here to get a picture of what was truly portable across different implementations that are already working with this API. And I found the timeouts, and feel free to correct me. This is from an outside in perspective. I'm sure I got at least a few things wrong here. Everyone knows their own implementation better. I was especially bad at Kong health checks because they're a bit different in concept or in configuration than some of the other ones. So if I got things wrong, or if I couldn't quite figure out how to map things, definitely let me know. It did seem like there was pretty broad support on the health check front for interval, timeout, path, and just about everyone supported HTTP health checks, and obviously there was limited support for other protocols depending on the implementation. but there did seem to be a fair amount of support for a core set of features here. Timeout felt almost hilarious to me. You could see kind of the different underlying implementations here coming through. And again, I probably got things wrong here, but it seems like you could potentially map a generic timeout to, a request timeout for a number of implementations, and maybe map that to, both write and read timeout where they're split out. Maybe that's not completely accurate, but every implementation does have a slightly different take on timeouts. So interested in perspective here, if there is one generic timeout we can provide.
I think that, yeah, the request timeout's not too bad, but you need to be really clear that it's like client request timeout, because I know for Envoy, there's actually like 3 or 4 different request timeouts places where you can tune the request timeout. So when we're defining these things, you need to be really clear that this is from the perspective of the client, right? Like this is the overall timeout from the perspective of the client or whatever. Like it doesn't matter as long as but you have to be extremely specific. Because like, yeah, so I know for Envoy, connection idle timeouts can have, there's a few of them because it's the connection from the client to the Envoy and the Envoy to the backend. And those are different timeouts. There are, connect timeouts from Envoy to the backend. There's a whole bunch of them. And because there's actually like 4 different edges where you can mess with timeouts. And a couple of ones where the timeout is calculated on like the entire time from when the request is sent to the backend to when the request to the backend is closed. And there's a whole bunch of other ones like that where I had to draw diagrams to figure out which ones were the important ones. And naming them is really hard.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great point. And there is a wide variety in types of timeout supported. That is for sure. I'm interested, Harry, or any of the other implementers here from different implementations. Do you have something that could suffice as client request timeout? Like, would you propagate that through to write and read timeout, and would that make sense, or is that a misinterpretation of what that would mean?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many timeouts that I will have to go back and just make sure that read timeout and client request timeouts are same. And we'll need to define like client request timeout is I guess you make an HTTP request and then wait for a response and then it's like the beginning of the response or the end of the response. So details will matter a little bit there, I think.
Agreed.
The
beginning of the response versus the end of the response is a great example there, where if it's the end of the response, you're building in another couple of timeouts about response time duration and stuff like that.
Exactly. So that's why like it gets a little complicated, but I think at least client request timeout is something we can support. Maybe it's a bad way to name properties, right? And in Kong, it's deriving that from Nginx. So that's another like layer that we have to deal with, but that's on Kong.
Yeah, like I feel like the key part there is basically you're going to need on the page where you talk about timeouts, you're going to need like a diagram that's like, here's the lifetime of a HTTP request, going through a proxy, and here's what this timeout covers. So that then you can turn it into whatever your underlying proxy actually needs.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think looking at what's possible here, there's really only one that is, portable across more than a couple implementations, as far as I can tell. But maybe that's me lacking some creativity here. I think obviously the underlying implementation of, shared underlying implementation means more is possible than is currently exposed on a number of these. So we'll see.
Yeah, I know for Contour, there was a few where we specifically didn't expose them because it's really hard to explain to people what the timeout actually means.
Yeah.
It gets even more fun if you have layers like you have an ELB in front of Nginx, and the
Oh,
ELB has
yeah.
an idle timeout, and then the Nginx. So it's going to be a mess.
Yeah, absolutely. So like that's another reason is that, like you got to, if the timeouts for multiple layer proxy systems don't line up, then the one that applies is not always obvious.
One thing that gets me thinking is, since we are like maintainers and we get confused about these things, maybe there will be always requests to make timeouts configurable at fine-grained levels, but maybe we should think about how about having timeouts configured more granularly, like at a gateway level, and only have like exceptions to configure some timeouts at lower levels. How do we decide that? I don't know, but simplifying the story not just for ourselves but for our users would be, I think, a better approach here.
I 100% agree. We've had quite a few requests come into Contour where people are like, oh, I need to change the connect timeout. And then when we drill down into it, it's like, oh no, you actually need to change the client request timeout. But because the particular timeout that's relevant in a particular case is completely impenetrable.
Yeah,
so, yeah,
makes a lot of sense.
If we define client request timeout as a timeout from here to here in the life cycle of a HTTP request, how you implement that is up to you, and how you slice it up, then that's because a lot of the time I think when people say I want to be able to tune timeouts, it's because I have a broken app that will always cut off a connection after so many seconds, or something like that, and so I want the proxy to do that cutoff rather than the app, or something like that. Absolutely, though, the reason that people want to tune these so much is because, I think I've said this before in a different way, the proxy is the place where you get to fix things that people can't change because legacy apps or some other reason. The proxy is the place, like the ingress is the place where you can fix that.
Yeah, for sure. I know we're at time, so if anyone sees something on this list that's wrong, or if they see common ground where we could potentially provide a little bit more portability, definitely feel free to add content here, or also want to transition this kind of content back to an issue so we can get this discussion going on GitHub as well. With that said, there's a few things in PR and issue triage that I think we just don't have time for today. But if you have time, I want to highlight there's a blog post going up soon, hopefully, and we're trying to get LGTMs from at least every author on there, which would be one person from every implementation.
We have yeah, we've got our LGTMs. I'm submitting the PR to the Kubernetes blog later today. I think we're going to shoot for the 22nd of April, but I'll ping everybody on the post so that they can see the PR.
Great. And let's see what else is here. A couple small things. More discussion on service policy, some new additions. Just if you have some time, some bandwidth for reviews or to continue discussions on issues, there's plenty of activity. And but I think that's all the time we have for today. So let's call it at that.
Well, thank you for running a meeting that was worth getting up at 3 a.m. for.
Oh God, yes, and if we want to change this meeting time, I'm open to that too. So, thank you for waking up so early and for all your contributions. And have a great one.